Deana Morris, who is going to talk to us about
the miracle, the myth and the mystery of mirrors.
Perfect. So Deana Morris.
Just bear with, so I set up my little timer.
Yes, I'll do that.
Marvellous. Thank you.
Nice there.
So thank you, Tim, and thank you everyone who's turned out tonight. I have been here as a member of the audience before. I've never stood here before, and to be honest, this is the first time I've stood and spoken to an audience since I was 15 years old. I know. So
That's a round of applause.
There's a part of me that's sat on the sofa at home, reading a book, thinking, what the hell are you doing? This is not us. We do not stand in front of people. We do not do this talking thing. And yet here I am, stepping through fear, discovering that when we do things that challenge us, something magical happens. And I'm going to come back a little bit more to that for a while. So yeah, I'm new in town. I've been making a lot of changes in my life over the past 5 years. I used to live in Manchester. My partner and I, we moved to Eastbourne. We've made some big changes in the way that we live, and we love it here, by the way. Fantastic town. So amazing. Does not rain here every day. Who knew that could happen? I now work quite a lot from home. I'm a writer, I'm an editor. I'm also a yoga teacher, and I'm a hypnotherapist. And all these strands may seem very different, but there's something that comes together when they plait, and that is, I hear stories, I listen to stories, I interpret stories, and I feel stories, and sometimes I feel them in my head, in my heart, and sometimes you have that gut reaction to a story. So while you may think, oh yeah, I can see how she hears stories when she writes, and I can see how she hears stories as a therapist, I see stories as a yoga teacher as well, because our bodies tell stories. When I'm teaching a class, we quite often, and you will know this if you go to a yoga class, we talk about Tadasana, which is mountain pose. Perfect for a speaker. So you stand very tall and you pull up those muscles, you let your shoulders go back, you feel those little bones and the balls of your feet press down so you're tall and strong. And something else that you do is put your feet hip distance apart. Now, this is what I'm doing now, but quite often in a class I see someone do this. They have this idea that their body is somehow much wider than their hips, that their hips are out here somewhere. When in fact, when we stand hip distance apart, our feet are absolutely under our hips. Now that tells me something that touches me here. I know that that person has a disconnect between their mind and their body. And so in yoga, we don't use mirrors. We use the idea of seeing in a different way, and quite often we do yoga with our eyes closed. Yet mirrors, we hear ourselves say, the mirror never lies. And yet, if we look back in myth and mystery and fairy tales, we discover that mirrors, they're not so truthful. Now, I got interested in myth and mystery and fable, I think, as a child. I don't know if you remember those Enid Blyton books of Greek myths. That's what got me going. And then I got interested in Nordic myth, and I loved Beowulf and Grendel and all those fabulous stories of heroes and villains. And then, as I grew older, as I travelled across Europe and then North America and then Central and South America, I started collecting books. Books about myth and mystery and about the folklore of indigenous cultures, and I discovered there were some very common themes, because we think we're all so different. We think because we look at ourselves, we're so much different from each other, but how we appear on the surface is such a tiny part of who we are, and the commonalities are enormous. Now, mirrors crop up a lot. Mirrors are very ancient. They go back to the Egyptian times, and they're found in pharaohs' tombs. So that's going back to 1400 BC. It's a long time. You'll maybe remember them in stories like, there's Narcissus, isn't there? That Greek guy who fell in love with his own reflection. You remember him? Maybe not the brightest kitten in the basket, because he drowned in that pool and couldn't hear Echo telling him how much she loved him. But there are mirrors in other stories which you don't see in the versions that we're given as children. At some point in the 19th century, when Hans Christian Andersen and the Brothers Grimm were writing their books and reinterpreting their stories, they wrote them in a way that would make them blockbusters of their time, and maybe in ways that suited the culture of the time. So, for instance, the Snow Queen. You might be familiar with this story. The story of Kai and Gerda, of the story of the little bit of ice that gets into Kai's heart. And he goes from being a nice boy to a mean boy, and the Snow Queen gathers him up and she takes him off, and little Gerda goes looking out for him, and she goes through all these trials and tribulations and goes through all these hurdles to then win him back with the power of her tears and her love. Now, because I'm a questioner, and because I'm a little bit older, I ask myself, how likely is it for us to believe that we can change people, that no matter how kind we are to them, they will change, when in fact it's us that need to change. We are our own change. We can't change people. And yet that story is the one that we grew up listening to. There's another story though underneath that story, because what I discovered is these stories are older, far older than the books that we read as children. And they have so much wisdom within them. The story of the Snow Queen goes right back, much further back, to the time when we believed in angels and demons. And there was a demon who created a mirror that encapsulated all the wickedness that he could think of. Because that demon was furious. He was furious with God because God had given mankind the gift of sight. And while mankind could not believe how glorious and beautiful nature was, the demon could not believe how happy mankind was. So in his wickedness and fury and anger, he created this mirror that was huge and large. But when you looked in the mirror, you didn't see yourself. You saw the opposite of yourself. So when the demon took the mirror and he shone it in the faces of all of the people, of all of the children, what they saw was the opposite of what they were. Where there was kindness, they saw evil. Where there was beauty, they saw ugliness. Where there was generosity, they saw avarice. And the people became unhappy, and the demon was delighted. He took his mirror, and his idea was to take it up and shine it into the very face of God. But as he climbed and flew further and further up, he laughed so hard that the mirror started to shake, and the demon started to shake, and together they shook, and the mirror fell and smashed into 100,000 little pieces, which found their way into sand, into the sea, and into glass. And the glass became part of things like spectacles. So when people put on glasses and they expected to see well, what they saw was a distorted version of the world. And some people, they looked into mirrors, and what they saw was not what was there. It was a different version of themselves. Now, for some of us, we know that to be today body dysmorphia. It affects about 1% of the population. They see themselves as thinner, or they see themselves as fatter as they are. And for many of us, I think, we look in the mirror and we have a different relationship with the mirror than maybe we would wish to. Have you ever walking across a shopping precinct? I know this has happened to me. who's that woman? She doesn't look very happy. And as you get closer, you realise it's you. You're walking along with this face of sadness all the time, and yet looking in a mirror, looking in a reflective surface, should be a moment of joy and connection with yourself, and yet somehow we get lost in this. I know my relationship with the mirror was very less than positive when I was younger. I spent a lot of my time in my 20s and my 30s eating less and less and less, thinking if I was thinner, if I looked like this, if I could be 9 stone, 8.5 stone, I would somehow be better than I was. And what I realised as I got older is it doesn't matter whether I weigh 11 stone, 10 stone, 9 stone, 8 stone. And I was really trying for, 8.5 stone, which as a 5'8" woman is not sensible. But it didn't matter. It was a story that I could see in the mirror. There was some discord going on. And it was only through yoga and connecting with my body and my mind and having some very good therapy that I began to understand these stories started in my childhood, and they were myths that I'd created that were not my truth. They were a misinterpretation that I'd taken and held on to, and they were dictating how I was living my life. Now, the Snow Queen, she's not the only person with a mirror. You might remember Snow White, another lady from our fairy tales. Snow White had a stepmother who spent so much time looking in a mirror, and you remember that mirror, I'm sure. And while Snow White, the Disneyfication ideal of beauty, that two-dimensional, squeaky-voiced, singing little girl, was out in the woods looking after 7 men child, doing the washing up, the cleaning, and somehow very happy with that life. Interesting, isn't it? But the stepmother, she was at home, stood in front of that mirror, looking at herself and asking, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? But was it the mirror that was talking to her? Was it her heart talking to her? Was she a woman who just got so caught up in the idea that beauty is youth, that no amount of serum that she put on her face and no amount of wishing and no amount of wanting could actually take her back to where she thought she needed to be? And maybe if the mirror had actually spoken the truth, what it would have said is, you are the fairest of them all, and you were when you were a little girl, and you will be all your life, because you are the love of your life. You will always be your own truth, and you will always be enough. And that is all I have.
Thank you very much.
Well, there we are. Thank you. What an honest and brave talk. So, Deana Morris, that was lovely. Any questions for Deana before we finish the evening? Anybody have any questions, any thoughts about mirrors and reflections, or not, as the case may be? Maybe there are no questions. Maybe
I don't really want to ruin it. I'm glowing inside.
Well, there you go. You don't have to. That's a lovely. What a lovely response.
That was like, well, nice.
Yes.
That.
Sorry,
That was like, well, nice. Yeah.
Well, there we are. There we are. It was lovely.
Nice,
Yeah. So, well, I think on that note, then I'm not going to allow any questions. That's it. So, can we thank Deana for a wonderful.